Hi everyone, my name is Natalie. Today I wanted to talk about marginalia. So I know that this is a topic that we as readers have differing opinions about. Marginalia and writing in my books is something that I love to do, and I think it has been a few years since I moved into this form of interacting with my books. I feel like it was one of my reading goals, possibly one of the previous years that I've been doing reading goals videos. I feel like I've touched on this specifically as a reading goal or as something that I was considering when I was still new to this idea. But I wanted to talk about marginalia, both sort of why I do it and how I do it and in what scenario, in which books I do it, and also to hopefully you can share your thoughts on marginalia in the comments and we can have a discussion going. If you do it, if you don't do it, and why you don't do it. Any and all thoughts on marginalia can go in the description, can go into the comments so we can have a conversation about it. But I've been thinking about it in particular. I know that one of the books that I read recently talked about marginalia, and I can't find the quote. I'm pretty sure it is the A. Milne Year In Year Out essay collection that I finished sometime in the midpoint of January. I am fairly certain that he touches on this writing in the margins and having a conversation with the reader, having a conversation with the writer of the book, and again, so it again reminded me of this topic and the fact that I have quite a lot of things to say or thoughts surrounding the topic. And I've mentioned a few times recently, I think, that Alejandro Zambra talks in one of the essays in Not to Read. He talks about finding a book secondhand and reading it and then discovering that there's all of these comments in the margins from a reader who had not liked the book. And so he talks about having this dual experience of reading the book, of reading the main text and also reading all of this commentary alongside it, and how it influenced his reading experience. For me, finding marginalia in a secondhand book is most of the time something positive. Sometimes when you find books with writing in them secondhand, it's just sort of language-based stuff. Like, for example, when I look at English books in my local secondhand stores, sometimes you can tell that there's a Swedish reader who has translated English words that they are unfamiliar with in the margins and just made memory notes for themselves, or vice versa if it's a Swedish book and you can tell that Swedish is not the first language of the person who's read the book before. So those comments are not very interesting for someone who isn't in a similar situation, but as soon as the comments become more personal or analytical in form, that's when I tend to find that really fun. But I know, again, that people have very differing opinions about this, so feel free to share if you differ in if you find a book, you borrow it from the library or from a friend, or find it secondhand and you find writing in it. What's your first response? Is it a positive thing? Is it something that makes you curious, or is it sort of a horrifying moment? I know that there is people who write in library books, clearly, because one of the library books that I just finished reading had comments in them. My first response in that scenario is being a bit shocked by someone breaking the rules in that way. And I would never personally write in a library book. That's also one of the reasons that as soon as I feel like I have things I want to say in the margins and I am borrowing a library book, I will stop reading the library copy and buy my own copy so I can do that. Sometimes I will just write my own notes phone note to have go along with that book. But I don't really love to do notes in a separate place than the book itself, just because it's so easily lost, that information, and it just... I don't really look back on those kinds of notes if I find them in my phone or in a journal. I don't really look back on those, and for me, the purpose of writing the book means that when I reread that book, I have the notes exactly where I want them to be, so I can access them when that time comes. For me, there is three areas that I wanted to touch on. The first one is why I write in my books. So there's several reasons for this, but the biggest reason I think is that for me it means that I actively engage with the book. I find sometimes that when I'm just reading a book, I end up feeling more passive than I would like to. Writing in my books allows me to pause, to reflect, to have a moment to sort of create my own or formulate my own thoughts on what I'm reading, to consider how my reading, the current reading I do, fit into a larger reading history. For example, sometimes I write in the margins, I write things related to the books I've just read. If there's a kind of parallel with what I've been reading in a particular month, for example, or anything else like that. So for me, writing in my books is a way to engage directly with a book. It makes me feel like I'm more part of the reading experience. I'm more active, and it also helps with my memory. It helps me, again, because I'm stopping to pause and reflect and formulate my own thoughts. It means that it's easier for me to remember what I'm reading. Every time I do that, it's sort of the memories of the book become more, they stick more, is how I would put it. And also related to the memory aspect, it's also easier for me if I want to review a book, or if I want to talk about a book in a video, or write a review later, or in general discuss a book, like for example with a buddy read. It's much easier for me to remember the points I wanted to sort of highlight, or things that strike me as I'm reading, and sometimes you think that you will remember your main points or your main takeaways from a book, but it's so easy to lose track of those and forget as you go on and new things come up. So for me, a memory thing and being more actively engaged with the text is probably the main things when it comes to marginalia. The other aspect of this topic is when I write in my books. So like I said, I never write in library books. I don't do it as much in ebooks either, which is kind of ironic given the fact that it's actually easier to do in ebooks. You have the highlight option most of the time. It depends on the program, of course, but most of the time you have the option of highlighting in the book, and you have the option of making a note or comment. The same with audiobooks. But I find that with both ebooks and audiobooks, it's just not the easiest way for me to re-access them. So again, most of the time, because I usually borrow audiobooks and ebooks, it's very rare that I buy them. That means that those notes will be lost when my borrowing period is up. So I won't have those notes, so usually I try to take those notes somewhere else. I also don't find it as fluid to write in ebooks. Even though it has these tools, I don't really like to use them as much. Although I have also my issues with ebooks in general when it comes to the sensory experience of it. So those are examples of when I don't write in my books. There is also... it also depends on the book itself, like for example the genre of the book. when I first started writing my books, I wrote in academic literature, so course literature. That was how I got used to this type of stuff in the first place. And then it very easily moved into my nonfiction reading. I think a lot of people who write in their books start off with writing in their nonfiction, just because it's a sort of an easy extension from working with course literature. But these days I can as easily write in a fiction book. Usually the thing that makes me not write in my books when it comes to the type of book or genre is if it's a book I read purely for escapism. If it's a book that I get swept up by and I lose, I'm completely in the momentum of the book and pulled along, and I don't really have time to pause. That can be very rewarding and enjoyable in itself. If I read genre fiction, it's rarer that I write in them. And if I read poetry, for example, I'm not usually writing thoughts as much as I maybe am marking out my favorite poems. But most of the time, if I'm reading a book, I will write at least something in it. Most of the books I read, I think, have some form of marginalia in it, even though the amount of marginalia varies. And then we come to the how question, how I do my marginalia. So I call them marginalia, but a lot of the writing in my books that I do is not actually comments or writing in the margins. It's just symbols and underlining. I have used pen on the rare occasion that I haven't found a pencil in my near vicinity, but I'm still not quite to the point that I feel comfortable using pen in any paper. I'm kind of afraid of having it bleed through the page and that kind of thing. And I never use highlighters, but I use pencil, and there's a few forms of marginalia that I do. So the most common is probably just underlining, which I use for specific passages that I like. Most of the time it is the writing that makes me underline, so it is a quote or a passage that I want to remember, that I liked, that spoke to me in some way, something that particularly stands out to me and that I want to be able to find easily. I also use square brackets and braces, so I actually had to Google what these are called in English, but I use both of them, and I hadn't really thought about how I use them differently. There is kind of a difference, but it's mostly just by intuition that I use them differently. Again, I use them to mark out specific passages. Sometimes it's an entire paragraph, but usually it's just sort of a bulk of text that I want to easily find on the page that I particularly liked, or that I have some other comments I want to make on. And I was thinking about how I use these two differently, and I think most of the time square brackets is for me a content that I liked, but also a form of writing that I liked. So both the way it's conveyed and the content is something I want to mark out. That is why I use square brackets. Sometimes I use underlining within the square bracket, but most of the time a square bracket for me is sort of a replacement of an underlining, and it's often when it's such a big passage that underlining will just be underlining an entire page or an entire paragraph doesn't make sense to me. So square brackets fill in that purpose when it's a larger section. Braces, however, for me is more about just having the idea and the thought process, but not necessarily the writing. So it is not so much about the way, the words that is conveying the idea, it's the idea itself. So therefore, if I were to quote the book, I would not go to the braces to find the things I want to quote. I would recount what I find in the braces. that is more like the gist of the book, or the core ideas, is where I would look for the braces for that. So this probably sounds very confusing and overly thought out, but it was something that I actually considered because, as I said, I do most of this intuitively, and I hadn't really thought about how I use them differently, but I do. Sometimes I will use strikeout, basically to strike out text, and that is a fairly rare thing for me to do, but that is usually when I disagree with an author. Not in a form of it's an opinion differing, but it's usually when the author is offensive in some way that I do this strikeout. Then I have a symbol that I use frequently, and that is probably one of the more unusual in my marginalia, and that is I use an I symbol for things I want to look up. It's just to remember, like for example, if there's a particular book title that is referenced, or a song, an artist, a movie, a particular place, anything really that I want to look up and I want to remember that I want to look it up, I make this I symbol. And then the last form of marginalia is obviously comments, actual marginalia. And this can be of different types as well. Sometimes it is me disagreeing with an author and explaining my own point. Sometimes it is explaining why I like a particular passage or why I like a particular idea. Sometimes, as I mentioned earlier, it is me making parallels with other writing that I've read, other things, other media that I've consumed, real life connections that I make with what I'm reading, other things that the reading makes me think about, any and all things that strike me as important as I'm reading it. If I am planning on reviewing the book, or if I'm doing a buddy read, I might do different types of comments when I know that I will be discussing it in a particular format later, or in a particular forum. But most of the time it's just anything that really strikes me as important as I'm reading it. And sometimes it's probably things that wouldn't be interesting to anyone else, and might not even be valuable to anyone else, but that is important to me. But I think when I started doing marginalia, I did more comments that might not have been that necessary, just because I was sort of getting used to this whole practice. Whereas now, usually when I write something, it's because I have a thought that I think is actually worth having there, so that when I revisit it, it will actually be helpful to me, either in my rereading of the book or in reviewing the book. For example, if I'm looking back on my comments and want to remember the points I wanted to include in a review, for example. So yeah, I think that was all I wanted to say about marginalia. Probably a very chatty video, but it's just something that I've been thinking about, because for me it's regular practice. I do it with most of the books I read, and it's something I love to do. I would love to hear what you think about writing in your books. If you do it, what style you do it, what kind of symbols do you use, what kind of things do you comment on, or if you don't do it, why don't you do it? What are your thoughts in general? I would love to talk about it in the comments. I hope you're doing well and you're taking care of yourselves, and I will talk to you soon. Bye.